Today we are looking at the French revolutions that took place and somewhat comparing them to the American revolutions and then later the Haitian revolutions, because you had this series of Atlantic revolutions that took place around the same time periods that really were influenced by the Enlightenment period, as well as the thinking that took place during that time period. And you see that then reflected in not only why the revolutions took place, but also the declarations of independence and other items as far as thinking of how a government should function and whatnot. So you have the Enlightenment period, it was influenced by that. You have the declarations, the reason for revolution, which definitely took part and connected to views of government, especially the idea of kingship and the role of people and what it should play. And so all of that impacted that. Of course, there are other aspects from it as well, as far as the desire. You see with the American Revolution, it was, in many cases, there's this idea that the American Revolution was completely revolutionary. It was a whole new idea. And it was in the sense of a new idea to overthrow a king. That was definitely a new concept, a new idea. However, the social aspect was not revolutionary. And what I mean by this is that they weren't looking to change the structure and nature of society. They still wanted, the wealthy and their place, and let's say wealthy and educated, that they were the ones that were supposed to be in charge. I mean, just look at the founding fathers who set up specific rules with voting early on, that you had to have a certain amount of land and wealth, because they felt that the poor would just run and create this mob sense of rule that was undignified and not educated enough to rule sufficiently. And so you had the Constitution, you had the structure of government set up to create limitations and not change drastically the nature of that. You also saw that with the remainder of slaves and just even roles of women as well. There was a letter by Abigail Adams and to her husband John Adams. And this probably best shows to John Adams here that desire to not change. She writes to her husband and says, "Remember the ladies." That was the letter. Well, it's what the title that we give it now. It was one of the statements in her letter was, "Remember the ladies when you're creating your new code of laws, and that we want to be included." And he wrote back saying, "I can't help but laugh at that. You're so saucy." This is the first inclination we've seen that a whole new tribe is discontent. And what he meant by that is, of course, that you had people during the revolution. As much as the social aspect was not revolutionary, there were challenges to it during the American Revolution. So there were people that were looking to end slavery, to have women like Abigail Adams to be included, indentured servants that wanted to be free, because the language was freedom from tyranny, liberty, equality, things like that. And so there were obviously people who were thinking that that would include them. However, the founding fathers and those that set it up did not want that to change, and ultimately it didn't. Right? He wrote it back saying, that's not going to happen. I would have our men fight with the same level we fight against despotism and tyranny and oligarchy. So he used all of these words, which was significant because these words were seen as the worst of the worst. That's what they used in the Declaration of Independence. It's what they were fighting for. A despot ruler is cruel rule, oligarchy. You have a rule by a select few, a tyrant, right, as the king. And these were all the things that they've been fighting against. And he's saying that he would hope that men would fight as strong as they fought against these horrible rules as they would against women trying to have rights and freedom and control. So that's kind of shows you this idea that he didn't want that to change. They was not interested in that change. And that was the same for most. Again, there were those that fought against and wanted to end slavery, but most wanted the social system to stay the same, especially those in power and those that set up the control. So the revolutionary aspect of the American Revolution was the idea of overthrowing a king and ultimately setting up, a republic instead with democratic aspects, right? It was not a true democracy by any means. Full democracy, you're going to have everyone has an opportunity, draw by lots, things like that. And so that was a difference there. Whereas we have with the French Revolution a difference that takes place, which is that you have two parts. You have a political change, and we're going to look at that today. And a look for the French Revolution kind of goes back and forth. It's a political change and wanting to have at first a constitutional monarchy, and then they get rid of the king altogether, and then you're going to have Napoleon, which essentially he titled himself an emperor / we'll say dictator, and then it goes back to kingship. And there's some other smaller things in between, right? So there was a lot of whiplash in the French Revolution, and things didn't stick in political change. The other thing that they were looking for was social change. And we'll see this within the estates, and especially the third estate looking to change their condition and structure, right? And then we'll see for the Haitian Revolution that you are going to have some political change, just in the nature of overthrowing it as a colony, right? It was a colonial rule with the French being in charge, and so they're by the nature of revolting against that, you're changing the political structure there, but even more so than that was a social component that was more than just wealthy and poor, but had to do with slave and free, had a race component to it. And that this played a much larger change and was a significant revolutionary aspect, because it was the only fully successful slave revolt that actually did what it set out to accomplish, and this sent shockwaves throughout. So throughout, like with not just France but the U.S., which feared encouraging other slave revolts and things like that. So you have these three kind of main revolutions that were taking place with these Atlantic revolutions, all that had slightly different reasons for revolt, and yet we're still connected to the Enlightenment period and Enlightenment thinking, with the idea of talking about equality, what type of government should be ruling, the notion that it didn't need to be divine right through kingship, that maybe divine right wasn't even a thing. And they all were influenced by the Enlightenment period, and of course the French and Haitian Revolution were influenced by the American Revolution as well. So with the French Revolution, then what we want to first look at is the estates. The estates were essentially classes, social classes, that were broken up into three groups within France. So you had the first estate, which was set up with the clergy. You had the second estate, which was the nobility, and the third estate, which was everyone else, the commoners. And these estates really set up your social structure and status within society. It influenced taxes and what you had to pay for taxes, social structure, involvement in the government. Now, technically, each estate had some representation, if the king chose to call them, right? France at this point is absolute monarchy. So let's look at the structure of France here. And of course, what that means is that the king has absolute rule. He is not confined by the Constitution. There's no Constitution. The king has complete control over laws, society, technically the justice system. You know, the king, if this is definitely the king's word is law. And that can mean that people are somewhat at the mercy of the king. Now, there was one aspect in it, the nobility. The nobility technically had the ability, and we'll see the third estate is going to have the ability to revolt altogether. But if you're looking at a lesser issue with absolute rule, the nobility did have the power, because of money, to challenge the king. The king needed the support of the nobility. And he got this, actually, was set up earlier by Louis XIV with Versailles, which is the best example of absolute rule. The Palace of Versailles, it really signifies absolute rule with how the structure. So they had pageants, and moved. Well, he moved the court. So the King Louis moved the court to Versailles from Paris, and then made all of the nobility live there. And at the time, it was seen as decently far away from Paris. Right now, with cars and things like that, it's not as bad. But at the time, it was far away from Paris. And so if they wanted to participate in court, they really had to move there. And so he built Versailles from which was a small hunting lodge into a massive, massive palace as it is today that you can go see. It's quite amazing. And not only with the courtyard and the gardens and the palace itself, but he set up and built structures for the nobility to live, so that they would spend most of their time not at their estates, but at the palace. And then they could participate in the pageantry of absolute rule and Louis XIV. doing so, having all of their focused attention being on garnering favor with the king rather than looking for potential ways to gain control outside of Louis XIV. And so they spent all their money on clothing and outfits and focus at the court. And so you don't have excess money to raise up arms or support against the king. You don't have any spare time to think about anything else other than the whole focus is that the Versailles was centered around the king. So Louis XIV set up this precedent, and that became the structure of France. Now, the problem with it by the time we get to the king, which is also King Louis, but Louis XVI, when you have the French revolutions, is that this system created an economic hardship on France. And not just an economic hardship on France. I mean, that was a big thing as part of it. They were having serious issues with not enough food. The lower classes were taxed really high. And so you had a lot of, poor and poverty. On top of that, in order to maintain absolute rule and control and power, there often are a lot of military campaigns. But the problem with having a lot of military campaigns, of course, is that ultimately, this costs money as well. So it created a massive drain on resources. And Louis XVI was indecisive. He was not a strong leader. And all of these things, we'll put that too, are not helpful and kind of set up the scene for what happens with allowing for change, and that kind of everything was in the right place, along with the Enlightenment thinking, along with the American Revolution in the back of their minds. All of this then played a role in what sets the scene for them to be able to set up a series and system of changes. Of course, it wasn't just one thing, right? They intended to change small things, and it spun out of control, if you will, from there, and then changed the type of political leadership frequently. Unlike, right, the American Revolution, which switched and stuck, the French Revolution went back and forth. And that's in part because their initial intention was not to get rid of the king, but revise and reform certain elements, as well as tackle some of these issues that absolute monarchy had created with the poor and poverty and that structure in France. So besides this, the other thing that you had, and I mentioned taxes in there, but you had specifically with taxes, that was an issue that had to do, of course, with the money, and King Louis XVI looking for a way to raise money to solve some of the problems, is that the first and second estate were almost not taxed. They will say not taxed very much. If anything, there were lots of exemptions. Most were not taxed, which meant that the burden of tax, as I mentioned, went to the third estate, to the poorest of France, rather than to the wealthiest. So what Louis XVI wanted to do, I'm just going to say Louis from now on, this is the 16th, right? The 14th was just an example of setting up an absolute monarchy under Versailles. Louis was hoping to get the nobility to agree to some taxes. So he wanted to increase taxes, but specifically for the higher estates. Now, while it was an absolute monarchy, there was a rule with the Estates General. And this is where the estates, the first through third estates, had some political involvement, although rarely. If you wanted to change the taxes, or end, we'll say end the tax exemptions from the first two estates, right? The king was required to call an estates general assembly. So he couldn't, as much as the king, which is, again, this is interesting because the king with absolute power had a lot of it. And yet this was one area where he had to call an estates general where the three estates would meet. And not the third estate, the three estates together would meet. And then they would vote on whatever his proposal was. Now, the estates general was almost never called. And the reason for this is that when you called an estates general, they had the ability to bring questions and grievances to the king. This could end up, where this could go with this, is that this could end up having them vote to limit certain powers of the king. So understandably, the kings had not called the estates general in a long time, because it was better to bypass this system if you could, because there was always a risk that if there were grievances or they banded together and voted a certain way, then not only could they reject his proposal for tax changes, but they could actually bring up grievances and vote on things that limited and restricted his power. But because the king was desperate for funds, this became kind of his only option, especially with how King Louis XVI worked. And so he ended up calling the estates general, and hoping that he could convince the, like I said, first and second estate to agree to end some of their tax exemptions. Now, from the start, this was going to be problematic because we just looked before at the system and state with which France was in, which was that the poor, there was a lot of poverty, there was a serious issue with food, there were grievances with the wealth and extravagance of the court and the nobility at Versailles, which it was pretty bad. Not only did the court nobility at Versailles live in luxury and wealth with excessive food, but the what was supposed to happen is that the food they didn't eat was supposed to be distributed to the poor. However, this wasn't being done very well, and so what ultimately happened is it would sit around for a while and then start to rot, and then when it finally got distributed to people, he was distributing, well, not King Louis personally, but they saw it as King Louis giving them rotten food, which just seemed to add insult to injury to their problems, notwithstanding, of course, the luxury and wealth that seemed to be exhibited by the nobility and the king in this process. So when the third estate came to the meeting that Louis had called, they already were, the leaders specifically, wanted more authority. So they already had a plan in mind as far as what they thought they were hoping to achieve. They wanted a written constitution, which definitely was influenced by the American Revolution and the Constitution. And they wanted guaranteed political participation by all people. So they already had an agenda coming into this, and that's going to create issues from the start with how the Estates General was structured. So how it worked is that they all met together and ended up having a collective vote. The problem with this is that because the first and second estate were usually aligned together in whatever they want, which was often against the third estate, it meant that one estate, again, oops, that's what I'm going to do, the third estate specifically, it could have been any estate, but it usually was the third estate was easily outvoted. And so the third estate specifically protested this system when they met up and said, right, we want to change the system as well, because this is unfair to us. And instead of meeting separately, so right, they met separately and then they all voted as a collective vote. So instead they said, we need to meet together. So the idea being that everyone would see each other and potentially could influence, right, votes. And then you don't have this collective vote from each estate, but instead you have individual votes, right? Because what would happen is with a collective vote, even if some people within a specific estate didn't agree, if the majority voted one way, then that's what the estate general, like the first estate, agreed to do. If the second estate, if you still had people that disagreed, but the majority said yes, then the second estate's vote was yes. And the same thing with the third estate, right? So they're saying, instead of meeting separately and having collective votes, we need to all meet up together and talk, and then we need to have individual votes, because they thought that might actually give them a chance to sway some people from the first and second estate, so that they might have a chance of actually making a change at this process. What happens with this meeting, and this is again where you see King Louis's weakness and issues within that, is that they presented this to Louis, this idea to him, and he wavered on it, and went back and forth between saying yes and no. This led the third estate to declare themselves a National Assembly of France under the approval of Louis, even though, he technically didn't do that. He said yes, and then he said no, and then he went back and forth, and so they took it as, okay, he's supporting us, so they're like, great, we're changing it, it's going to be a National Assembly of France. And the third estate did is they invited the other two estates to join them with this National Assembly that they were creating. Only a few did. So it wasn't well received from the other estates. And then what King Louis did is that he, after going back and forth and then seeing what was happening, the king actually barred them from the meeting hall, the National Assembly from the meeting hall. So this caused a lot of confusion because many had believed that the king was supporting them. It also created a lot of discontent and dislike with the king. So what they ended up doing is what became known as the tennis court oath. Because the third estate showed up to the meeting thinking that they were now in National Assembly with the king's support, and they were locked out. They literally, the first and second state were there, and the king had ordered the doors be locked so they weren't allowed in. So they crossed the street and went to an indoor tennis court, and there they made, this is where then it's why it's the tennis court oath, because they were actually in an indoor tennis court, and they made an oath to not go home until they had France had a written constitution. And this is going to be the start of then, well, you already have the tension and issues, but then this is going to create an uptick in conflict and issues that's going to lead to actual, not rebellion, but mini revolts, if you will. Uprisings is probably a better word for it. That are going to take place in part because of how the king responds, right? Because he's going to keep going back and forth, and he's going to not pick a clear side, and that's going to lead to a lot of discontent and dislike for the king, although he wasn't particularly well liked to begin with. So I was just looking at a couple of images here I wanted to show you. So here's King Louis the 16th. And this is a great example of the do a little bit of here so you can see the extravagance even in this image of one of the things that was part of absolute monarchy and Versailles and the king was, I mean, you just look the extravagance of the clothing. This became its own pageantry in of itself, and also showed off the extreme wealth. These outfits that not only the king wore were often yearly salaries of nobility, right? So not even the commoner and stuff. They're extremely expensive, and it just showcased over and over again this excessive wealth in that. Here you have a political cartoon where it shows the first estate with the sorry, not the first estate, the third estate here. And you have the first and second estate on the backs, on the back of the first estate. And this was published around this time that all of this was changing, and it was meant to be a political cartoon commenting on how with taxes and burden, right, you have someone who's poor farmer and is poorly clothed with the wealthy all riding on the back of the third estate. And so there was a lot of public critique during this time about what was happening as the third estate was looking to make changes. And then here you have the tennis court oath where they where it was them meeting to agree on creating a French constitution, as well as trying to showcase this idea of all of the estates getting along, which is what they were trying to showcase. Even if that wasn't exactly what was going on, this idea that everyone was getting along and agreeing to policy. So what happens after this? You have changes. Here we go. Let's go up here with this. You have changes that take place. Let's see here. With, we'll say, responses and reaction to the National Assembly and the estates. And after they swore the tennis court oath, then King Louis gave in again. So he's now flip-flopped multiple times. So he then appeared to accept and order the estates to meet after the tennis court oath. However, what also happened is that he summoned his troops from Versailles. So what might this come off to people as if he's agreeing for them to, yes, go ahead and do this and meet and figure out your constitution, whatever else, I support it, and then at the same time having his troops come in from Versailles? Well, it doesn't look good, because it basically looks like he's going to have the troops put down whatever changes are happening while he's pretending to support it. There's argument about this, about whether or not he actually really supported it or really meant for the troops to come in and put them down, or whether he was just concerned that there would be public unrest, and so he was bringing the troops in. It's hard to tell. Louis really was super wishy-washy about everything and not a strong king. And so you ended up with this problem of uncertainty, which just led to further conflict. So not surprising, right? News of the troops got passed around before they showed up. And this created and led to riots or uprisings that I was talking about. And there was a series of riots that took place because of fear of the troops coming in. And so one of them was that you did have farmers in the country that rioted and overthrew so you had nobility that owned estates, and then farmers who worked those estates and paid taxes. And so what they did is they actually stormed these nobles' estates and got rid of the tax ledger book so that they didn't owe money. And that you also had some riots in the streets that took place as well, people protesting, destroying things. You had mobs of citizens. So in the city, you did have mobs that ended up showing up and were sacking the city and causing problems. The most significant or well known for sure was the storming of Bastille. Now, Bastille had a lot of significance. It used to be a prison. It had been converted to an armory, and part of the reason why they chose to storm it is because they believed that it still had a lot of weapons that they could use to defend themselves from the mobs, the citizens, as well as defend against King Louis's incoming troops. And so this it became a symbol too, because the prison had held political prisoners in the past, and so, like I said, it was a perfect storm of both potential for weapons as well as a symbol for the corruption of the absolute monarchy and King Louis. And so they stormed it, hoping to probably both to show off that symbolism as well as to get this cache of weapons that they believed were there. The prison commandant panicked and lowered the drawbridge, which all of this led to the destruction of the Bastille. When Louis hears that the prison is being attacked and stormed, he panics, and so we'll put that right here. So right here again, Louis panics at the news and declares that he supports the end of absolute monarchy and creating a constitution, which he doesn't really like. So that's part of the problem, is that if he had really actually wanted the change to revise, right, because they were still not looking to get rid of the king, that instead that he had support from the beginning, they were looking for just more reform, and then it moved to constitution, which he still could have had a lot of power and control for how it was shaped. But instead, with all this flip-flopping and panic, he ends up just acquiescing over and over and then going back on what he says. All of this creates significant problems. So he says he's okay, I support this, instead of, and here's where he probably should have, if he wanted to keep control, is just let his army go in and put down the riots and assert control. But he didn't do that. He panics, says he supports the end of absolute monarchy and will share the power between right. So instead it's going to be the king and the National Assembly with the Constitution. That's what he's going to support, is the changes for that. So they celebrate that, and the National Assembly then gets to work on two things. The first is going to be the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, which is we're going to look at. It's a kind of a combination of the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights, and then of course creating a constitution as well. So we're going to look at the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen and kind of see how Enlightenment influenced it, similarities between the Declaration of Independence as well as the Bill of Rights, and then we'll look at what happens after that, because of course, not surprisingly, King Louis is going to go back on the support of this as well. All right, so we're looking at, oh, and I did want to show you the next one. Here is the storming of the Bastille, here with them conflicting with the guards. So if we go back to the Declarations of Rights of Man and Citizen, you see here, we'll put some notes on there with that. The very first one, men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Social distinctions may be founded only upon the general good, which right off the bat, right, this is targeting the social issues, which we talked about, not just the political, but targeting with the estates and the complaints that they had. Then, and the that idea of, again, that they're born and remain free and equal of rights, this is very much connected to the Enlightenment thinking. And you see in the Declaration of Independence that, you know, all men are created equal, and then it's going to go to certain unalienable rights, and we can go over to that one real quick and look at that here. So this is the Declaration of Independence. Here we go. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. I mean, that's straight out of Enlightenment thinking and wording. And then they have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So, and then this is the view of the change of government. One of the Enlightenment things was that rethinking the role of government and what its purpose was. And here it says, to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So this idea of what is the role of government, that is very much also an Enlightenment thinking. What we're going to look at and compare, right? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Originally, this was going to be property, but then they changed it because they felt like they couldn't ensure a right of property. So they changed it to the pursuit of happiness. Here you're going to see, right, the aim of all, so back to the Declarations of Rights of Men and Citizen, the aim of all political association is the preservation of the natural and prescriptible rights of men. Again, a different way of saying it, but it's that natural rights of man, unalienable rights. These rights are liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. So they go, you have liberty, property, which they did include in, and Thomas Jefferson helped them write this, so it's not surprising that we see some similarities in that. Security and resistance to oppression. The principle of all sovereignty resides essentially in the nation. No body nor individual may exercise any authority which does not proceed directly from the nation. So again, this goes to rights and role of the government. Now here again, they're still not looking to get rid of the king yet, so the government is the king. But that's still addressing that same idea. Liberty consists in the freedom to do everything which injures no one else. This is also straight out of Enlightenment thinking. It was a huge idea of what freedom and liberty meant. And one of the theories and philosophies was that Governments and people should have the freedom to do what they want as long as it doesn't impede on someone else. Or governments should have the right to do what they want. Governments protect to make sure that people have the freedom and right to do what they want. Hence, the exercise of natural rights of each man has no limits except those which assure the other members of society the enjoyment of the same rights. And that then this needs to be set up by law. Law can only prohibit such actions that are hurtful to society. Nothing may be prevented which is not forbidden by law, and no one may be forced to do anything not provided by the law. So again, this is setting up not only this for the law, but the setting themselves up for the future structure of the Constitution that they wanted to create. Law is the expression of general will. Again, all of this is even more so. So the Declaration of Independence definitely had its influence and connection in Enlightenment thinking. This even more so. I mean, it feels like every line they're pulling from Enlightenment thinkers and what was being said, which is not surprising because a lot of the Enlightenment movement was taking place in Europe and traveled to America. But the main authors of the Enlightenment were coming from Europe, and so this definitely was influenced by that. And Thomas Jefferson was very much influenced by Enlightenment thinking. Here, this is where we get more into similarities with the Bill of Rights. No person shall be accused, arrested, or imprisoned except in the cases and according to the forms prescribed by the law. The Bill of Rights also, again, connected to changes in government. How do you form a government based on new Enlightenment thinking? All right, apologies. I don't know if you heard that loud bang. Something fell on the small little shed I'm in that I'm recording from, and so I paused it for a second. Okay, so you have, again, these different laws, more like the Bill of Rights, that are setting up and using these ideas of protection from the government, while also looking at what rights do people have. And so it's talking about punishment. All persons are held innocent until they shall have been declared guilty. The freedom from religious views, freedom of speech, right? So if you went and compared and looked at the Bill of Rights here and looked at the different, we're breaking them down here: innocent until proven guilty, freedom of religion, freedom of speech. It lines up in a lot of same ways, and because these were the new ideas that were circulating that were seen as important for protecting people, because again, the new idea of the government was that the people, had to have protection from the government and abuse specifically, right? The government was supposed to work for them. It was the will of the people, but you also had to create a sense of protection around that to make sure that it didn't get abused within that. So, and then also the security of rights of men and citizens requires public military forces, and so these are established for the good of all, not the personal advantages of those that are entrusted, which is also a little slight at the king in that process. Okay, so that's the Declaration of Rights of Men and Citizen, where you see it's this amalgamation of both the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights. And because it definitely had that influence, both with, of course, that you had Thomas Jefferson helping out with it, but also because that, as I mentioned, it was also ripped right from theories and ideas of the Enlightenment. And you could have gone straight back to individual people and pulled word for word what they're saying, and this pulled into that structure and idea. Okay, so now we have looking at we'll do a new one here that well, it's still responses, so we'll keep it as that. So surprise, surprise, King Louis didn't respond well to these changes, as he sat back in his palace thinking about what was going on and his loss of power that was taking place. And so once again, he tries to back out of what he agrees to, of what he had agreed to, as well as looking to send troops now to Versailles. Which at this point, like, if he was going to send troops to Versailles, he needed to do it when the Estates General was meeting initially. It's a little too late at this point, and so not surprisingly, Paris responds violently, and you have riots that take place over, and then you had, which was the Women's March. Now, this was not just about the fact of government change. This culminated with bread issues as well. You had, there was a short supply of bread. That it was super expensive and it was hard to get, and so women were upset that they weren't able to feed their children, and then you're hearing about the king causing all of these problems. So what you ended up having is over 6,000 women that gained people as they marched to Versailles. And there were a series of pictures of not only women, but soldiers joining in, soldiers that on their bayonet had speared a loaf of bread, and the women made up songs and protest slogans. But it was about the inability to feed their children, and coincided with everything else because of what was seen as a continued issue with the king's decision. So they went to Versailles specifically to confront the king. And like I said, they marched from Paris to Versailles. They actually threatened physical harm on the king if he didn't make changes and help them out. They also forced the king and his family, and this is significant out of all of that, to move back to Paris and essentially be hostages. The official thing was to be under supervision to prevent him changing his mind or sending troops. Because at this point, the common people felt that the best bet for them was the National Assembly in these changes, and they wanted to prevent changes because they felt like, as far as the food and economy and all the problems, that this would make things better. But this essentially was house arrest, if you will. They were not allowed to leave. And this is the first step in being a puppet king before he's removed altogether. A lot of his power has been stripped at this point. Here we have, this is the Women's March, where you can see that not only, this one doesn't show the soldiers. There were soldiers and men and children that joined them as well, but it shows them holding these different weapons. And what it doesn't show, though, is that there were at least reports that they had speared, not only them, but some soldiers had speared loaves of bread, and they did have weapons and soldiers that when they showed up at Versailles to force the king back, and in that sense incredibly successful in the fact that they did manage to force the king to return. Or not return, but go to Paris and stay there. So this changes. Now we have some significant changes taking place with it shifting to not only a constitutional monarchy, but ultimately the demise of the monarchy as well. And you have to say that definitely Louis played a part in this, with his indecisiveness and wish-washiness and changing back and forth, which caused a continued and additional outrage versus the type of power and authority he might have had under a constitutional monarchy if he had been involved in the changes, because they were not initially looking, again, to change significantly the structure outside of establishing and creating some protections. So significant changes that happened after this point, after Louis and his family were now held under supervision in Paris. You had the National Assembly decide to make some significant changes within what I guess issues that they had with society and social structure. So they confiscated the land used by the Catholic Church, because remember the clergy. One of the things is that the clergy and the Catholic Church had supported absolute monarchy. That they worked together. They had been not just complicit, but actively involved in supporting the idea of absolute rule. And then of course they were on the highest estates, which was seen as problematic as well. So they confiscated land used by the Catholic Church that was for non-religious purposes. The Catholic Church was quite wealthy, and they had land that was not churches. And so any land that was not used for a church or directly connected to, services and things like that, they confiscated. And the purpose was that what they wanted to do, the National Assembly, is that they wanted to auction off the land and give the money to pay France's debt, which was significant, as we have talked about, because of that absolute monarchy and military and structure as well. They also wanted to use it to be able to issue bonds, which could be used as money. And for the people, and redeemed after the land was sold. And this was to infuse money into with the commoners, and then they were hoping to, what they were hoping for was to make situations better for the poor, but it did end up creating inflation and a weakened economy. So it kind of backfired on what they were hoping to accomplish with this. Then they made the clergy civil servants. So there was a significant backlash to religion at this time, again, in part because they had been so supportive of absolute monarchy. The clergy were now required to swear an oath to the state. And they were supposed to have specific functions and purposes for jobs as civil servants. And then, of course, they were working on a written constitution. And within the written constitution, they established that the king had absolute veto and authority to appoint ministers. So he had veto power. Again, they're still not looking to remove the king, even if they're holding him under house arrest. It was basically, we're going to hold you under house arrest until we get this entirely done, so you can't keep screwing this up. He had the power to appoint ministers and conduct diplomacy. Now, this is significant decreased power compared to, of course, absolute monarchy. And then the other requirement, of course, is that he had to share power and control of France with an elected legislative assembly. And that, again, how much power he has versus the legislative assembly could have been significant, if he could have retained a lot of power if he had worked with them from the beginning. So Louis doesn't like this. He doesn't like any of this change, that what happens, and so Louis and family decide to flee their house arrest. What they hoped to do, and his wife supposedly had convinced him of this as well, but what they had hoped to do was to go to Emperor Leopold the second, who was the brother of Marie Antoinette, his wife, of Louis's wife. And what they hoped would happen there is that when they fled there, they can convince Leopold to help him invade, I guess, take back France and restore absolute monarchy. You definitely see that during this time there is this sense of the other European kingdoms and people who were watching this with concern, right? Understandably, if you're a king and you're seeing a king being put on house arrest, losing his power, you're going to be concerned. And so not only, of course, because he was the brother of Marie Antoinette, but also other absolute rulers kind of banded together because they didn't want to lose their power and authority. They fled at night. This story just shows how out of touch the king was. So they fled at night. Then they were under house arrest. People knew who they were. They fled at night. But Louis decided as they were fleeing to stop to eat. And not surprisingly, they were recognized while they went to eat. They weren't really trying to hide it either, and they were returned to Paris. This is significant because this is the end of Louis's reign. He's not executed just yet, but this is not going to. He's not going to have any type of power and control anymore. He's essentially, what happens after this is he's forced to sign and agree to everything that the National Assembly will say, to everything, right? There's no authority left after this event. It was still seen as, I mean, it's silly in the sense of that they left. And then, stop to eat rather than just sneaking out. One of the larger concerns and consequences of this was a fear of that this action, that the king's action, even though he has almost no authority anymore after they catch him, is that it would threaten the new constitution. Because it clearly showed that, one, he was being held under house arrest, and that he was against it. And there were people who were against these changes, and there was a legitimate concern that this would rally up support for Louis, and threaten to upend this brand new constitution that was being created, because it was all very new and it wasn't secure in its position. So while a silly move in terms of maybe not the escape, but then being like, oh, we're fine, let's stop for dinner. No one's going to notice us in our royal fancy clothing and our escorts. It's all good. is that the actions, you know, everyone, there was no facade anymore that the king was making any decisions or had any authority or control, and reasserted and affirmed to people that the king was against these changes, because they'd been putting out the propaganda. The National Assembly had been putting out the propaganda that the king fully supported this, which he didn't. And so it did threaten that. So what they ended up doing, which isn't necessarily a better option, is that there became a call for war against Austria and Prussia. Now, why, might you ask, is if you're already a new, you know, constitution, things are fraught, the king doesn't support this, why go to war? And not just a war that you have to defend about. They activated this war. They set it up. So they were concerned, there was concerns, and I mentioned this with the monarchs, right, that other monarchs would come to Louis's aid. And there was discussion that Austria and Prussia were ones that were looking to undermine them. There was another belief, besides that this would, if they acted first, it would prevent other monarchs from coming in and freeing Louis, essentially, and giving back his power, was that this would unite the French people together. And if it united the French people together, then they'd be able to better make the changes and secure. What they thought is that this would equal strong government. It doesn't, and they almost lose the war, so it was a poor decision. Louis ends up supporting this, so they do give strong support, because he hoped that Austria and Prussia would win. He said this to some people, which wasn't smart either. But if they would win, right, then that would equal giving him his power back. So he in public, he fully supported this initiative, hoping that if the palace was stormed, not the palace was stormed, but if the France was defeated, then he would get back his control. Of course, this led to, which I guess was technically true, he wasn't working for him, so that part's not true. He became under suspicion. They began to suspect, the French people, that Louis was working for Austria and Prussia. Now, he wanted them to win, because he thought it would give him back his power, but he was not working for them. This led to citizens storming the palace. This is his end. He's going to end up being executed soon thereafter from this, and lead to the abolition of the monarchy because of these events. What ends up happening is should move this on as a new one. This leads into the next section of the revolution. You have the National Convention and the Reign of Terror, which is a whole new section of the French Revolution. So the National Assembly was in charge up to this point, and at the beginning still is, because of the suspicions and actions. The Assembly called for a National Convention, because they were still working on this Constitution, by the way. It was not done quickly, which will continue to be problematic to draft a new constitution. And then because of the whole situation with running away, right, the previous constitution had a constitutional monarchy. But because now they were abolishing the monarchy, they needed to create a new constitution that didn't have a monarch. So the National Assembly, after this whole fiasco and storming of the palace, the Assembly calls for a new national convention to create a new constitution without the monarchy. And then they put Louis on trial for treason based on working with the enemy, Austria and Prussia. And this was definitely connected to that idea of the Enlightenment with the whole social contract idea, which we were looking at, that the government has power, a king or any ruler or government only has power because of the will of the people, and it's supposed to be for the good of the people. He was found guilty and condemned to death. And put to death. He was executed by the guillotine. Now, what's interesting with the guillotine is the guillotine was a new Enlightenment method of executing people. It was seen as how it worked before is, we'll say previously, prior to really the Enlightenment, you had public executions. They're still going to have public executions. But there was a connection of torture with it, and the idea of pain, and showcasing that, because this prevented people from copying the crime of also doing the same crime. If you show a really painful, torturous public execution, then people are gonna be like, oh, well, I was gonna commit that murder or that thievery, but now I see how horrible it'd be for punishment. I'm not gonna do it. And the Enlightenment thinking had been very critical of, public executions. Those don't stop, though. But they were very also publicly against torture, as well as secret court trials and hearings. And so the guillotine was seen as an effective, quick, painless death. And it was definitely seen as the more humane way to execute someone. Ironically, within this, though, the Reign of Terror is going to use the guillotine so much that it also becomes this symbol of abuse of power and really the opposite of anything humane. It also created this really interesting thing with because people they're beheaded so quickly. There was huge speculation if people were alive after they were beheaded, and in part this was because questioned here is right if. So one of the things with this that took place is it was a new way of executing someone. It was very fast, and people started noticing that some of the people executed would blink afterwards or seem to look around. And because we'll see with the Committee of Public Safety and the Reign of Terror, so many people were executed, this kind of became a thing where people that were going to be executed would say that they were going to try to blink so many times if they were still conscious after they were beheaded, or they were going to do certain things. And so people would look for signs after people were beheaded to determine and argue whether or not that because it was so fast, the brain hadn't made the connection that you're dead, and that people were still aware after their head was chopped off. It was this whole thing that they wrote these papers and books about, that people did experiments with, like asking people who were to be executed to agree to try to blink, 5 times or 2 times, or make some kind of notice with their eyes if they were aware, and they recorded all of this stuff. So it became this fascination with the guillotine, but also a very negative thing with the guillotine, because you're going to move into this really mass execution phase. So you move from, like, again, the National Assembly and an attempt to create a constitutional monarchy that has Enlightenment ideas of looking out for the people, to, we're going to see with the Committee of Public Safety and then the Reign of Terror, an abuse of power and abuse of people, just throwing out all of the stuff that had just been put about how people should be treated, what should happen with that, and it all goes away. So you have the Committee of Public Safety, specifically was a group of officials, a smaller group, that were given broad powers to run the government. And they were their function was one to protect, because they're still at war with Austria and Prussia, France, against foreign and domestic enemies, which you can hopefully see where this is going to lead to mass executions when everyone starts getting labeled an enemy. Why this was allowed to happen is that the Constitution was still not finished. And so you didn't have an official government and structure of power and control. And the longer it takes to do this, the longer that this group can be in power. Maximilien Robespierre was selected to be in charge. And he became the face of that torture and well, not torture, but mass execution, and also just, again, changes in laws and rules that ended up abusing the people, that the whole point of the revolution, when it started, was meant to prevent. So because, again, remember, war with Austria and Prussia still going on, that hasn't ended. There is fear. They get really close to losing. So there was conscription into the army, and it created a huge army. It was massive, and largely untrained, though, which did lead to many people dying. And of course, the whole thing of the military is supposed to be there to protect the people and not force conscription, didn't happen. And then you have the Reign of Terror, which specifically was targeting these, what we'll say, right, the enemies, in quotations, because most were not. They created what was tribunals. So this also went against the court systems, because these were not always public. They were secretive, they were quick, and not fair. It's just amazing, like I said, how much it went against everything that they were originally trying to do. If you spoke out against the Committee of Public Safety, if you spoke out against the war or anything that was seen as contrary, you were labeled an enemy and taken to a tribunal. Thousands and thousands of people were put to death during this period, all with the guillotine. So the Reign of Terror really is an appropriate name for that. because it terrorized people. It terrorized people to speak out. It terrorized people. The whole Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, the list of rights and stuff they had, those all just kind of got thrown away during this period, in part because of fear and in part because of a small group of men that kind of took power. When the war with Austria and Prussia ended, people began to see the whole Committee of Public Safety as unnecessary, and Maximilien was actually executed by guillotine as well. All right, this creates like this unstable system in France, because of the fact that they still don't have a fully functional constitution. You have all these executions, you have instability. So what this leads to is a direct result of the reign of terror in the Committee of Public Safety is you get the Directory. And the Directory, so this is before Napoleon, the Directory was made up of 5 men that were supposed to run the country. So we just keep getting smaller and smaller in the number of people, right? It goes to a constitution, it goes to a elected legislature, and then it goes to the Committee of Public Safety, which is now a smaller group of men, and then the Directory, which is the smallest out there altogether. So what they hope to do is unite France against foreign foes. That was like their big kind of thing. And the foreign foes were, so I guess it's Britain, Spain, Austria, and Prussia, of course, who they saw as opposing and again, a lot of people wasn't that they were, well, these were all monarchs, and so there was some fear. Right now you've executed a king, and other monarchs are not going to take kindly to that, and on top of that, right, you look at it and go, wait, what is going on here? That was part of the United States. We kind of, like, when they asked for help, right, France helped us in the Revolutionary War, and then we're like, oh, anytime you need help, we'll be there for you. And then France came to us at the beginning of the Revolutionary War and was like, yeah, we need help, we're doing what you did. And we're like, ooh, we're kind of busy right now, it's kind of a bad time, sorry. So we totally screwed over France. At the same time, though, you look at France was totally chaotic in what was going on, and one of the main arguments was, what are we supposed to support here? Who are we supporting? There's no clear consensus, and then that certainly was a solid foundation argument, considering what continued to happen from this. This did lead to the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, who was able to take advantage of the situation. He had risen to ranks in the military during the Austrian and Prussia War, and people had taken notice of his skill, and this had helped move him up in not only military standing but social standing as well. So in 1793, he was a 24-year-old general, which is very young, even for back then, and shows his military skill. He wanted for able generals to appoint him to lead. Well, they were desperate for, so the 5 men, the Directory, they were desperate for generals, which is part of the reason why he did get moved up so fast. Lots of people died. And on top of that, they wanted generals that were actually good to lead an invasion into Italy, because France was still thinking, let's expand and all of this. So Napoleon took advantage of this after so many victories within the military and as a general, as well as also his popularity, which was soaring at the time. Many people wanted a stronger government. And he convinced the Directory to put him in power. Right? This is kind of actually, you know, now Napoleon's not like Hitler, but it is interesting when you look at certain leaders that take over, that they usually convince certain governments to put them in power or allow them to take over, right? He was a military, he was a general, he was charismatic, he was young and strong, and all of this was appealing to French people at the time, right? Because there had been so much chaos and structure and loss of structure during all of these revolutions, and so people began to see Napoleon as the solution. Napoleon could bring France back to greatness. Napoleon could bring back a government and strengthen it, and then this will solidify, you know, what's going on with that. So what he does is, after he convinces them to be in power, he has them name himself first consul. And this is very much hearkening back to the Roman Empire, Republic and Empire. So in the Roman world, they had consuls. In the Republic, you had 2 consuls in their government, and then the Senate. And the consuls were elected by the Senate, and it was meant to reinforce kings. When it moved to the empire, under Augustus first, he was named first princeps, but also first consul, and there was only one consul. So he very much attempted to create this sense of Roman Empire structure and power. He also created a plebiscite to get this control, which was the vote of the people, which can be used as a democratic method, but this was totally structured around propaganda, and it's easy for abuse, right? So one, if you can't get the people to support you through propaganda where you win the vote fairly, you just have your people stuff the ballot boxes, and then that popular vote wins anyways. And so he got first consul through creating this plebiscite, getting the support of the people, and that essentially made him completely, fully in control, to the point that he ends up getting named emperor, you know, a part of that as well, which is also part of like that Roman structure. So the things that he did and changed as first consul, I mean, he did control inflation, and of course expanded and created, we should say, not just expanded, he created a French empire, right, through expansion, through warfare and expansion, which of course freaked out the rest of Europe. There was this whole thing called balance of power, and the fear that the great powers should not get too big or take over too much territory, because that disrupted the balance of power. And of course, Napoleon going around and conquering and taking over everything completely threw off the balance of power, and of course was destroying kingdoms and nations in the process. And he definitely scared everyone in Europe. So that, of course, what this is ultimately going to create is all of Europe against Napoleon, which is going to eventually lead to problems. But he conquers, he's super successful at first. He conquers a ton of areas. He actually has, with the Louisiana Purchase, it was actually something we bought from Napoleon after things started to go against Napoleon. Because inevitably, when you have the entire European continent against you, you're only going to be successful for so long. The other problem, of course, is that he invaded Russia in the winter. One of the things you should learn against this, right? So problems with this is never invade Russia in the winter, especially by yourself. Russia, the size and population, it's too much for people, and it ultimately destroyed them, and eventually that led to the beginning of the end for the decline. But before that, you have a massive expansion and creation of a French empire. The other thing he did is he created the French law codes, or the Napoleonic Code. This reinstated specific laws and rules with private property. All male citizens were equal, but it had a negative effect for women. Under the first early signs of the Republic, so say bad for women. Women were often considered in the process of being equal, and had a lot of authority and say, and Napoleon was definitely old school views of women, and not giving them rights, and seeing them as, they're supposed to get married and have children, and that's their purpose. He did create a system based on merit within the government rather than nobility. So some of what Napoleon did was not bad inherently with the ideas, and other things were not so good in that process. He did repair the rift between the Catholic Church and the state, because of course that had been somewhat negative after their land was taken away, and they were made to be part of the civil service. And the revolution really had been anti-Catholic Church much of this time. But he did become a military dictatorship. Besides also conquering and taking over massive swaths of land. There was no more elections after he had the plebiscite to elect him first consul. He got rid of, disbanded, and disregarded. He first disregarded, I guess I should add that first, the French assemblies. So they technically, for a part of it, had the French assemblies and were keeping up the facade of a republic, but he didn't ever use them and completely ignored them. He did censor speech and the press, which of course, again, if we're looking at the Declarations of Rights of Man and Citizen, that was the opposite of what that said on there. You had massive propaganda, and it worked. He was well liked for long periods of time. He had police spies that were looking to ensure support for him and arrest anyone against him. So you have the secret police, really, if you will, and there was a lot of people arrested in that. Ultimately, what happens is that he falls with Russia, and then he's exiled. So with loss in Russia, this began the continued. This was a steady decline after this, and he began losing various military battles in that process, and this eventually led to his defeat. Once he was defeated, he was actually exiled to an island. Then what they did, we'll put this as 1, is then the great powers convened and were like, what do we do now? We have to reorganize the boundaries and the borders, and how are we going to reset up stuff? So they ultimately decide to put a king back into place, another Louis that was related to the king. So you started with kingship, right? And ended with kingship. So in terms of political structure, they ended up exactly in the same place. What's crazy with this is that he escapes exile and takes back over. The king just nopes right out of there. He's like, I'm not going to be beheaded. And he leaves. The king's like, nope, nope, nope. And takes off. He comes back and tries to regain the military. And for a while does, because he still had a lot of popular support. And then eventually defeated again. The king gets put back in. And king comes back. And Napoleon eventually dies in exile. But it is crazy that he was able to escape the island in exile, take back over, and kind of terrorize again for a little bit the other countries. Maybe not France itself, but others. But what you end up with ultimately, right, is that the king in the end it's back to kingship. France becomes a monarchy again, but at the meantime, one of the larger consequences is this devastates the political structure in Europe, and also creates a fear of those in political power. Okay, so we'll stop there. We're going to look at the Haitian Revolution next, but that's the end of where we're going with the French Revolution.